zooming out from looking at just neuron to neuron and speaking about how these neurons connect together to really form the nervous system. So we're going to describe the different types of neurons and supporting cells, and we'll talk about some other important central nervous system structures and functions. So the central nervous system is really the brain and spinal cord, and then everything outside of that constitutes the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is vital for maintaining homeostasis. We talked about this region of the body as being the integrating center. So decisions are made here in terms of maintaining homeostasis, temperature, pH, heart rate. All of those variables are regulated in the central nervous system. This contains many neurons, right? About 100 billion neurons, and many more synapses, about 100 trillion synapses. So lots of players involved in the nervous system. And as you can see, these are really important functions. This controls everything we do and think and taste and touch and feel. All of our sensory perception is modulated through the central nervous system. All of our actions, the innervation of skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, all of that is regulated through the central nervous system. But unfortunately, the central nervous system is still one of the most least understood or poorly understood organ systems of our body, right? There's still a lot that we don't quite understand about how the brain works, especially when it comes to the behavioral aspect of the brain, why we do the things we do, and so on and so forth. Okay. So for any of you who are going into grad studies or any type of research careers, this is a really ripe field for conducting research. So the general anatomy of the CNS includes neurons, right? These are the most important players. These are actually sending and receiving signals via action potentials, which we've talked a lot about. And then there are glial cells, which are really non-excitable cells. So they're not really sending and receiving signals, but they're more involved in support. We'll talk about how. Then we've got the physical support of the nervous system, which we'll speak about, the blood supply, how the brain gets its blood, the blood-brain barrier, which is an important function to protect the brain. And then lastly, we'll look at myelination with gray and white matter. So neurons are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. Again, these are the most important players in terms of synaptic communication. They respond to chemical and physical stimuli. So neurons have a whole lot of different functions, from movement to perception. This is how we can perceive temperature differences, pressure differences throughout the body. They conduct electrochemical impulses, which we spoke about. That is an action potential. They release chemical regulators, which are neurotransmitters. That is also involved in that relay of signals. And so they enable us to perceive different types of sensory stimuli. They enable us to learn, to form new memories, to generate thoughts and emotions. They also control more practical and physical functions like glandular secretions, walking, talking, moving, jumping, which are muscular actions, right? Most neurons cannot divide, so that's kind of a drawback for neurons. They do not replicate very easily, but they can repair themselves in the instance of being damaged. And that's one of the more recent areas of research with regard to neurons, is the fact that they have this ability to regenerate, whereas previously the scientific community thought that neurons could not repair. They can actually repair themselves. Okay, so we can classify neurons based upon two different ways, or two different classifications based upon their structure, so how they look, and that's called a structural classification. And this is where neurons differ in the number of axons. So we can have unipolar neurons, pseudopolar neurons, based upon the way they look. But a more meaningful way to classify neurons is a functional classification. So this is based upon their function or their role, their job, what they're doing. And on that basis, we can speak about sensory neurons, motor neurons, and then interneurons, which help to bridge the sensory and motor connection. So As I mentioned, the functional classification is much more meaningful. That's what we'll focus on. So sensory neurons basically conduct impulses from sensory receptors towards the central nervous system. This happens on afferent fibers. So afferent with an A are sensory fibers that are traveling from target organs and from peripheral tissues towards the central nervous system. They are bringing in information about things that we see, things that we hear, things that we touch, right? Temperature perception, just any type of sensory information is perceived and received via sensory neurons. We can also speak about motor neurons. So motor neurons are traveling in the opposite direction. They're going from the central nervous system out towards different target organs such as muscles, both skeletal and autonomic muscles, as well as glands, right? And they're basically taking information from the central nervous system with instructions towards those target organs and glands. And then in the middle, connecting or bridging the gap are association or interneurons. These are usually located specifically within the central nervous system, and they help to integrate function between sensory and motor neurons within the central nervous system. A really interesting example of interneurons is their involvement with reflexes. So if you've ever touched something really hot and you pull your hand away without even thinking about it, or if you stepped on something sharp and you lifted your leg without even thinking about it, that is when interneuron comes into play. So without you having a conscious thought, that interneuron makes a connection between that sensory perception of something sharp and you lifting your leg, which is the motor connection. So between sensory and motor is that interneuron which bridges the gap. Okay, so we'll move on here to speak about our glial cells. So these are the supporting cells of the nervous system. Now, interestingly enough, they make up most of the CNS. So 75 to 90% of the central nervous system is neuroglia. Neuroglia is just the supporting matter, the supporting tissue that is not actually a neuron. So they basically support or help our neurons in different ways. They are non-excitable, meaning they do not fire action potentials, but they facilitate an environment where neurons can actually fire action potentials. And so in this image here, we can see all of this, all of these different cells, all of these players of the nervous system. Interestingly, we can also see the division between the CNS and the PNS. So most of these cells are actually located in the CNS. We'll talk about them individually, but I just want to point out how they look on this image. So we've got the neuron itself. We've got the axon, which projects from the CNS all the way out into the PNS. We've got the astrocytes, which as we can see are connecting neurons to blood vessels. We've got the microglia, which are off in the periphery. We'll talk about their function. And then we've also got the two cells that are involved in myelinating these neurons. So in the CNS, we've got oligodendrocytes, and out in the PNS, we've got Schwann cells. Okay, so our 5 cells are astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglia, oligodendrocytes, and Schwann cells. And again, we'll speak about each of those